Hey there, it's Silver, and this is Septaroad Voyager, an obvious play on Octopath Traveler, but of course this game actually has nothing to do with Octopath Traveler gameplay-wise, and it's actually basically a sort of 2D adaptation of something like Final Fantasy XII mixed with a couple of other things, which is interesting because, well, we don't see a lot of Final Fantasy XII inspired stuff. You know, there are lots of games that take inspiration from Final Fantasies of many eras, but 12 is not really one of those that gets sort of spun off into inspiration territory for other games most of the time. So I'm definitely a fan of anything that wants to try that because I actually quite like FF12, and I think using some of those mechanics is a good idea because a lot of them were pretty good ideas in and of themselves, and since we don't really see other games taking that sort of inspiration, I'm always a fan of people trying new things and stuff like that. So yeah, this is of course early access, as is the name of the series, and it is still pretty early as far as early access goes, but there is at least enough content here to sink your teeth into to get an idea of what the game is going to be like and how it's going to progress and stuff. So I do have some criticisms and some suggestions and stuff, but I'm going to save all of that for later on in the video because first off, what the heck is it? Well, it is an RPG, and it's a party-based RPG that uses real-time combat, but a JRPG-like menu system. So you just click your mouse and a menu will pop up allowing you to choose to attack an enemy that's in range of you or use an ability or things like that. And you can control one character at a time, but you can very easily flick between all of your characters at once and then just sort of give them all orders. And in fact, the game does have a very useful pause function in the options menu to where you can make it so that when the menu is open, the game automatically pauses so that you can flick through your party members and give them orders while it's paused, and then close the menu and everything will unpause and continue. I appreciate this feature. This is something that FF12 actually did, having a wait mode allowing you to just better input tactics and stuff for your party so that the combat wasn't too messy, because that is of course a danger of a menu-based real-time combat system like this is the fights can get messy, and that definitely is something that happens in this game to a certain extent, but I find that enabling the wait mode in the options menu really helps a lot. You'll be traveling through a very large open world. It's a sort of grid-based map where every square of the grid is a very large open area, and each open area is separated by load screens. So again, actually kind of like FF12, honestly, only maybe even a little bit larger than that in terms of the size of each zone. But there's a lot here, and each zone is relatively flat, but does tend to have a good amount of enemies and stuff dotted throughout it. And there's not a lot of like loot to find, like treasure chest style loot to find, but there's a lot of loot to be found on enemies themselves. So most of what you're doing while exploring is combat. In some of these areas are some towns, and there are of course all sorts of quests available in towns, some of which are repeatable, others just sort of are meant to be kind of like a story. You know, there's not really a story in the game as it is yet, but they are the sort of main quest line that's meant to progress through you growing your party, if you know what I mean, because you will just start with one character, but you can quickly get more than that as you do these quests. Some FF12 style mechanics involved here include the tactics system, as it's called in this game, with a little stylized T there, and this is the gambit system from Final Fantasy XII with their stylized G, and this is a welcome addition because of how messy combat in a game like this can get. This allows you to not have to micromanage every character all the time. So you set up different conditions, and then you set up a certain action to do on those conditions, and then as long as you turn that tactic on, the party member will automatically do whatever it is you told them to do. So if you say, if any ally has less than 50% HP, then cast a healing spell, then that means as soon as someone drops below 50, then a healing spell will fly out, and that happens automatically, and you don't have to actually make them do it manually every time. It was a great system in FF12, and it's a very good system here as well. Being able to take away some of the micromanagement of a party in a real-time combat system like this by automating their responses to various situations is a very good idea, and I welcome any game that wants to try out their own version of that gambit system, and it works really well. You can even go to different NPCs that are actually tactics sellers that'll sell their own, just like the gambit merchants in FF12, and they'll sell their own tactics that you can put in slots, and the tactics get really, really specific. You know, you can find like if an ally has a specific buff on them, or if an enemy is weak to a certain element, or perhaps if there are a certain number of enemies minimum around, and some other things. So there's a lot of control. You have very fine control of the automation of your party members, And as you level them up, you can unlock new tactics slots so that you can further and more precisely expand what it is they can do automatically. And of course, when you combine the tactics system with the ability to pause in combat, you get a very controllable game. You get a combat system that tends to flow very well and does a good job of giving you a lot of tactical options at any given time, while also making sure that you have a lot of fine control over each character's different abilities and things that they could possibly learn as they level. Another very clearly FF12 inspired system is the skill board. So Final Fantasy XII had a license board for each character, or if you're playing the Zodiac editions, each class. And these were big boards that you used these points that you got from battling to purchase new stuff, like the ability to equip equipment, the ability to use items, the new spells, and all sorts of things like that. And this game has a skill board that works in exactly the same way, and in fact looks very similar as well, sort of like a chessboard. And each class has its own skill board, and you will earn skill points as you defeat enemies, and you can spend these skill points on this board in whatever order you'd like to unlock whatever. Everyone will start as one of two basic classes, a sort of physical combat-based class or a magical-based class that has just a small sprinkling of abilities of various kinds that fit their archetype but are very general. And then within each of those boards, there will be more classes of their type. So on the physical class, you'll find like the knight and the paladin and the rogue and the ranger and things of that nature. Whereas for the more magey type, you'll of course have access to a lot of your common magey archetypes, including like healers, burst damage dealers, elemental, druids, warlocks for summoning stuff, and there's quite a bit of variety in terms of the classes, which I always appreciate. In a game like this, you kind of need a lot of class variety because all of your party members' main development is going to happen battle-wise in all of these boards, so you want a good selection of these boards to actually give people a lot of flexible and interesting build variety and stuff like that. So I do appreciate the class and board system that this game has. I think it does a good job. One thing I would like to see as a suggestion, though, is a sort of advanced class for each of the classes somewhere in their board. So perhaps somewhere on the Ranger's board is a new Sharpshooter class, or somewhere on the Paladin's board is like a Champion of Light or something like that. Basically, they each have one extra evolution that's a sort of advanced class of what that class specializes in, with even more high-level and powerful abilities and equipment and stuff. I think this would be a good idea for the later game because it would give each character more of a variety to work towards once they have sort of, put their points into a couple of classes worth to get a good smattering of abilities. They can choose to specialize in some way and go for something more advanced. And I think it would be really cool to have something like that. One pretty unique mechanic the game has, by the way, is its dungeon system. I think it's pretty cool. You will occasionally find rumors and stuff that talk about certain dungeons, and you can research these items to find clues, and you can then go to like a library or a similar like research building and put these clues together with the dungeon rumors in order to make a path to a dungeon. And once you have enough clues to actually assemble the path, the dungeon portal will spawn somewhere depending on the sort of path that you created, because each clue has a certain type of terrain that is related to it, and you can then put this terrain in a specific order to lead up to the dungeon and allow you to find it and get in it. And each dungeon will have all sorts of different enemies and usually a boss and some stuff like that in it, and they're quite large, honestly. And the types of clues you put, the types of different terrain and stuff that you put on the path and in the dungeon itself, this determines the difficulty and the amount of loot rewarded. So you can go for like a high risk, high reward kind of idea, or you can sort of pare it back a little bit to try and get some levels and whatever else you want to do. It's a neat system and I like it. However, I'm not able to give you any footage of it because I don't understand how to get clues. I know what you do. The tutorial explained it. You gotta find these like written things like journals and any sort of like written data that allows you to research. And unfortunately, I don't know where to get that stuff. I've explored around a lot, done a lot of quests, met a lot of NPCs, listened to a lot of rumors, but I haven't actually found any research materials. I don't know how you find them. But as far as an RPG that is trying for like a Final Fantasy XII tribute with its own style, it's got a pretty unique feel to it, and I like what I've experienced so far, even though it's obviously still early days. If you've ever played, have you ever played like an MMO, like an obscure MMO? You've been exploring around weird parts of the internet, and you found like an old, mostly dead MMO, and you're like the only one playing, just sort of exploring this world by yourself. That's kind of what this game feels like, and I actually mean that as a compliment, because I think it's really fun to do stuff like that. This game reminds me of like one of those old school MMOs that you would happen across and just try out of morbid curiosity. It's a little bit like that mixed with like an FF12 skin that all comes together to make a pretty compelling gameplay-wise RPG, and I'm interested to see what the sort of character, narrative, story, all that stuff is going to be like once that is actually implemented. Now, I did mention some criticisms and stuff because this is early access and that's how you help them grow as campaigns. The first thing to say is I actually have a bug report. It seems that some quests like to reset. Now, there are repeatable quests that you're meant to be able to repeat, but I'm not talking about those. I mean like the story quests. They'll reset. You'll often go into a new town and you'll see an NPC that has a single-use quest that's meant to give them a broader variety of items for sale, and you'll go and do that quest and then it'll expand their inventory. Except you leave town for a while and come back, and their inventory will be reset back to its original state, and they'll be offering that quest again. You don't have to go and do it again just to get access to their better inventory. You have to like continually repeat this quest that's supposed to be a one-time thing. This culminated in one of these story quests, or story in quotes, it's not there yet, but the story quests where you have to go and clear out a graveyard. It actually repeated, and this meant that I had to clear out the graveyard again, but since I had already recruited the character that you get for completing this quest, instead the empty space where that character was supposed to be standing spoke a line of dialogue. Just a ghost, a non-existent character spoke this dialogue as if the character was still there and I didn't already have them in my party. So there's clearly something going on with these quests resetting when they shouldn't. But the biggest criticism I have, or really the biggest piece of advice, is that we've got to talk about the name situation. So this game is called Septaroad Voyager, an obvious play on Octopath Traveler because you have eventually 7 characters. You don't actually have access to all 7 of them yet in the current early access version, but that's the intention eventually. And I get the joke, I understand that it's a joke. However, I feel that the developer should genuinely consider changing it at some point. I normally wouldn't recommend something like this, it's kind of an extreme change, but I really do think the name is a bad idea. The simple reason is there's a lot of garbage on Steam, right? There's a ton of low-effort, soulless cash grabs that get released. Usually they have like punny or weird names, and I feel like a lot of people like me that like to dig through Steam and find the obscure gems hidden around there, a lot of those people are going to see this game and think, oh, it's one of those. It's one of those cash grabs, and just ignore it and not actually look into it. And it's not one of those cash grabs. It's actually a real RPG made by someone that actually cares, but it doesn't sound that way if you're searching through Steam and you don't necessarily have time to click on every single game. You might see a name like this and think, oh, it's just one of those, and then ignore it. And I think that the name of this game is sort of artificially limiting its audience because it's putting a cap on how many people are going to actually seriously look into it and how many people are going to just toss it aside as another one of those games and not really know. And if you're wondering if it's even possible to change a game's name once it's on sale, yes, it actually is. And in fact, a game that I took a look at relatively recently by the name of Summoner's Fate, a really good sort of deck builder CRPG combo. It's a very fun game. It actually changed its name when it released its full 1.0 version to Abalon because they felt that Summoner's Fate was a little generic and it just wasn't quite giving them the vibe that they wanted, you know, and so they changed it. So yeah, games do occasionally change names, and I think, honestly, if you were to think of any time to change a game's name before a lot of people know about it is the perfect time. Also, a little suggestion, I would really like to see some sort of attack nearest enemy button that I could bind. Because one of the most sort of time-consuming elements of the combat system as it currently is clicking, selecting attack, and then selecting an enemy every single time you want to attack an enemy. So if there are like 5 enemies on screen, you have to do that 5 separate times for each of them. Now you could set yourself up a tactic that makes yourself attack the nearest enemy, but that's not really a good idea because then you'll constantly be attacking everything, and we'll get into why that's an extra bad idea in just a second, but that's not really a good way to do it, and it would be nice just to be able to bind a key that says, hey, when I press this, automatically start combat against the enemy nearest to me. I think that would be a really useful feature just to speed up the combat a little bit and make the menus a little bit less finicky because you wouldn't have to go into the menu if you just wanted to start attacking every time. But the thing that I was mentioning as to why it's an even worse idea than you would think is because this game has something that definitely needs to be changed, which is its auto-pathing behavior. When you choose to attack an enemy, your character will just go to the appropriate distance automatically, except it's kind of buggy, and you can't interrupt it. So if your character is rushing around an enemy in the direction of something that you really don't want to aggro, too bad. You can't interrupt them. Even if you press the other direction, you can mash it on your keyboard as much as you want, you can't interrupt your character's movement, so you're going to aggro the entire zone, whether you like it or not. This is especially bad if you're using a ranged class of any kind, because sometimes your character just decides to start running and never stop. Like, at all. As soon as you press the attack command, your character will just book it. It's like several screens worth of space, and you can't stop them. You can't interrupt them at all. So they can sometimes just run in one direction for a really long time for no reason at all, to the point that they're like way out of range of their own attacks, but they decided to just like auto path in that way for some reason. This happens a lot with enemies and stuff that are at range. The algorithm that's being used for how to determine where to stand for range weapons seems to be a little finicky, and it would be nice if the characters didn't constantly rubber band all around the place in an uninterruptible way every time you press the attack command. But here's the thing, I'm mentioning all this not to pick it apart and be mean, but because this person clearly cares about what they're making. A lot of the times, if you look through the most recent updates for the game, you'll find that a lot of them were specific troubles that someone had on the forums. They posted them, and then like that same day, the developer pushed an update that fixed whatever they were talking about, added new menus, added new functionality, stuff like that. They've really been hard at work improving the game, and it's clear they actually care about it. So I'm mentioning all this because I know it's actionable information that the developer can actually do something with, and that seems to be their thing. They really like to have specific actionable information because they're quite good at pushing updates to fix people's woes, and I think it's really impressive how fast and how consistent they've been in terms of improving their game, which, you know, that's the whole point of early access, sure, but that isn't always how it works, and it's really nice to see someone taking their early access campaign very, very seriously and using all of the information to just make a better end product. As for my opinion on the game, I think one day it could be great. Right now, it's good. It's good because it does some interesting and unique things that I would like to see developed further, but I think with the right amount of time and the right amount of attention from its developer, who is clearly passionate about this, it could actually be quite great, and I'm interested to see where it goes from here. So I will link you in the description below this video to the Steam store page if you wish to check it out yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.